Let us suppose for our purposes today that we could read the headlines a week after that first Easter. What would the headlines look like if there was a Times of Jerusalem in the first century Palestine? We would have read the following headlines. Thomas doubts Jesus alive. If I were to mention the names of certain disciples to you and ask you to write down the first word that comes to your mind, it is unlikely you would come up with the same words. If I were to mention the name of Judas, many of you would write down the word betray, but not all of you. If I were to mention Simon Peter, some of you would write down the word faith, but not all of you. If I were to mention the name of James and John, some of you would have written down the phrase sons of thunder, but not all of you. But when I mention the word Thomas, there is little question about the word most everyone would write down. It would be the word doubt. Indeed, so closely have we associated Thomas with that word that we have coined a phrase to describe him, doubting Thomas. You may be interested to know that in the first three Gospels, we are told absolutely nothing at all about Thomas. It is in John's Gospel that he emerges as a distinct personality. There is not a lot about this disciple in the Bible, but there is more than one description. When Jesus turned his face towards Jerusalem, the disciples thought that it would be certain death for all of them. Surprisingly, it was Thomas who said, "Then let us go so that we may die with him." It was a courageous statement, yet we don't remember him for that. We also fail to point out that in this story of Thomas's doubt, we have one place in all the Gospels where the divinity of Christ is bluntly and unequivocally stated. It is interesting, is it not, that the story that gives Thomas his infamous nickname is the same story that has Thomas making an earth-shattering confession of faith. Look at his confession. "My Lord and my God." Not teacher, not Lord, not Messiah, but God. It is the only place where Jesus is called God without qualifications of any kind. It is uttered with conviction, as if Thomas was simply recognizing a fact, just as 2 plus 2 is 4, and the sun is in the sky. "You are my Lord and my God." These are certainly not words of a doubter. Unfortunately, history has remembered him for this scene where the resurrected Christ made an appearance to the disciples in a home in Jerusalem. Thomas was not present, and when he heard about the event, he refused to believe it. Maybe he was the forerunner of modern day cynicism. Maybe the news simply sounded too good to be true. Thomas said, "Unless I feel the nail prints in his hands, I will not believe." Now, I cannot help but notice that Thomas has separated himself from the disciples and therefore, in his solitude, missed the resurrection appearance. I think that John is suggesting to us that Christ appears most often within the community of believers that we call the church. And when we separate ourselves from the church, we take a chance on missing his unique presence. But the story doesn't end there. The second time Jesus made his appearance, Thomas was present with the disciples, and this time he too witnessed the event. This time he believed. What can we learn from the life of Thomas? First, Jesus did not blame Thomas for doubting. So often the church's handling of doubt is to couple it with disbelief and squash it. But Jesus never condemned Thomas. I think that he understood that once Thomas worked through his doubts, he would be one of the surest men in all Christian history. I must admit that I am dubious of people who say that they have never have any doubts. People who always seem so sure. I would suggest to you that any person who places himself beyond doubt places himself above Christ himself. On the cross, Jesus cried out, "Father, why have you forsaken me?" At a given time in history, even Jesus had doubts. Authentic faith always begins with intellectual honesty. and doubt is the bedrock of honesty. Put it another way, faith is not the absence of doubt, it is the overcoming of doubt. But then I am reminded that it was Alfred Lloyd Tennyson who said, "There is more faith in honest doubt than in half the creeds." So we find ourselves crying out, as did the disciples of old, "Lord, I believe, help my disbelief." Secondly, we can learn from the life of Thomas that the most endearing things in life can never be proven. Jesus said, "Thomas, you have believed because you have seen me. But blessed are those who have not seen, yet still believe." I don't know how that makes you feel, but it is of great comfort to me. Jesus is talking about me. I will never see Jesus in this life. I will not have the chance to put my finger in the nail scars. I will not get the chance to touch his pierced side. It will never be proven to me that he was raised from the dead. Jesus understands it's harder for me to believe than for Thomas, and he counts me blessed. But let me ask you, how can you conclusively prove the qualities of love, friendship, or faith? How can you establish beyond a shadow of doubt your devotion to your children? Show me a verifiable evidence that love exists. The cynic can always dismiss acts of love on your part as attempts at self-love or the need to control people. How can you prove to someone that you love your church? If the goal of your life is for someone to show you a photograph of God, then you will forever be disappointed. Let me tell you what happens when we live in a purely rationalistic world, one where miracles are removed from our way of thinking. It happened to Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson rejected the notion of miracles. When he approached the scriptures, he could not tolerate those passages which dealt with the supernatural. So what did he do? He wrote his own Bible. In the Thomas Jefferson Bible, you will find only the moral teachings and historical events of Jesus' life. No virgin birth, no healing of Jairus' daughter, no walking on water, and no resurrection. Here is how his Bible ends. There they laid Jesus and rolled a great stone at the mouth of the sepulchre and departed. For Thomas Jefferson, the gospel ends at the foot of a grave. It is very easy to rewrite history, to say that it did not happen. But the story remains that the disciples were witnesses to these events. Thomas Jefferson is in essence calling the disciples liars, and that they continued throughout the first century for 70 years to propagate those lies. Furthermore, Jefferson's Bible has been robbed of its power. I am convinced that the church does not accomplish 2000 years of life inside the walls of a closed dark sepulchre. There is no power in that dark place. Rather, the church is alive because he is alive forevermore. What we must understand is we had better leave some room for mysticism in our worldview. That does not preclude science. That does not preclude reason. What it does mean is that the most important things in your life will never be conclusively proved. You will, on daily and even more momentary basis, need to live by faith. If someone could in fact come along and scientifically prove the resurrection, then you would be living your life by fact and not by faith. But let me suggest something to you that I firmly believe. Even if a loved one who has been dead for years were to come back to life and tell you about the realities of heaven and of God and resurrection, you would not believe it. You recall the story Jesus tells about the man who is in hell and the other man who is in paradise. The man in hell wanted to come back to earth for a few moments to warn his friends and family about the torments of hell in the hopes of scaring them into right living. He hoped he could keep them from suffering the same fate. Jesus said that even if he were to return to warn his loved ones, they would not change their lives. And it would not change your world in the slightest either. God has called us to be the people of faith. What exists in heaven cannot be proved on earth. It must be believed. And so, we learn from the life of Thomas a third lesson. We must move beyond doubt to faith. It is all right to doubt, but in our discipleship, we should move beyond doubt. Jesus admonished Thomas, stop doubting and believe. Unbelief is a normal part of life, but it is not healthy to remain in unbelief. There are times in our lives when we face grief or disappointment or pain or depression. When these moments of true, deep doubt come, let me urge something upon you. Never doubt in the dark what God has told you in the light. Amen.